Deep in the unforgiving Amazon rainforest, Dr. James Harrington stumbled upon what no modern human was ever meant to find. Separated from his team during a violent monsoon, he survived on instinct alone for weeks. Dehydrated and delirious, he nearly missed it, ancient stone steps emerging from beneath centuries of earth and vines. The temple's walls told an impossible story, a civilization that predated all known history, with carvings depicting mathematical equations and astronomical charts that wouldn't be discovered for thousands of years. As he ventured deeper, James uncovered artifacts that challenged everything we know about human history. What if our understanding of civilization's origins is completely wrong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The chartered plane bounced through turbulence as Dr. James Harrington clutched the armrest, his weathered knuckles white with tension. At 58, he was too old for this nonsense, but the Amazon called to him like an old lover, dangerous but irresistible. "Not a fan of flying, Doc?" Maya Chen smirked from across the narrow aisle. At 32, the archaeologist represented everything James both admired and resented about the younger generation. Brilliant, fearless, and utterly convinced of her own infallibility. "Been doing it longer than you've been alive," James replied, patting the ancient compass hanging from a leather cord around his neck. "Just prefer having my feet on the ground." The small brass compass had been his father's, a relic from another era with markings that never quite matched any known navigation system. For 40 years, it had accompanied him on digs across 5 continents. A lucky charm in a profession where luck often mattered as much as skill. "We're beginning our descent to Puerto Esperanza," announced Carlos Mendoza. The guide, his voice barely audible over the engines. "Last stop before we disappear into the green." James glanced at the rest of his team. Dr. Sarah Williams, linguist extraordinaire, buried in notes about regional dialects. Robert Bobby Thompson, photographer and videographer, checking his equipment with methodical precision. A good team, maybe his last team, if the university trustees had their way. This expedition represented James' final chance at redemption. His controversial theories about pre-Columbian contact had made him an academic pariah. One last expedition to prove them all wrong, or confirm his irrelevance once and for all. The plane touched down on a dirt runway, kicking up dust that momentarily obscured the ramshackle buildings of Puerto Esperanza. The air hit them like a warm, wet blanket as they disembarked. "Welcome to nowhere," Carlos said, gesturing broadly at the small village. "We gather supplies here, then boat upriver for 2 days. After that, we walk." In the village's only cantina, over lukewarm beer and questionable stew, James spread out their maps. "The university expects us to catalogue indigenous settlements in this region," he said, tracing a finger along the tributary they would follow. "But local legends speak of stone structures deep in unexplored territory, the forbidden places." Carlos nodded, his expression guarded. "My grandmother told stories of the old ones who lived there before." "Before what?" Sarah asked, suddenly interested. Carlos shrugged. "Before everything." That night, as the others slept, James sat outside their rented rooms, studying his father's compass by lamplight. The needle didn't point north, never had, but swung lazily toward the very region they would explore. "Still believing in magic, old man?" Maya asked, emerging from the shadows. "Not magic. Just patterns we don't yet understand," James replied. "The review board almost didn't approve this expedition," she said, sitting beside him. "They think you're chasing ghosts." "Maybe I am," James admitted. "But 40 years of research tells me there's something out there that doesn't fit our neat historical narratives. And if there isn't, then I retire quietly and tend my garden," he said with a half-smile. "But if I'm right, everything changes." Dawn brought organized chaos as they loaded supplies onto 2 long boats. The humidity was oppressive, promising rain within days. "We're heading into the early monsoon season," Carlos warned. "Weather patterns are changing, becoming unpredictable." James felt the weight of uncertainty as he boarded, the compass warm against his chest. Perhaps it was foolish to risk everything on one final expedition. But as the boats pushed into the current, he felt that familiar tug, not just of adventure, but of destiny. The jungle closed around them like a living entity, watching, waiting. In his journal that evening, James wrote, "The Amazon doesn't reveal its secrets easily. It tests you first, breaks you down, sees what you're made of. I can't shake the feeling that something is waiting for us, something that will change everything." He didn't know then how prophetic those words would become. The jungle grew denser with each passing day. What began as a relatively pleasant boat journey had devolved into a grueling trek through vegetation that seemed determined to reclaim every inch they cleared. 5 days into their expedition, and already James felt the Amazon testing their resolve. "We should have seen some evidence of settlements by now," Maya said, slicing through a tangle of vines with her machete. Sweat had plastered her shirt to her back, dark patches spreading like ink blots. James consulted his GPS, then frowned at his compass. "According to the university's coordinates, we're right where indigenous structures should be. Maybe your theories were right after all." "Doc?" Bobby called from behind, his camera equipment hanging like technological fruit from his body. "Maybe there never was anyone here." Carlos, leading the group, suddenly raised his hand for silence. He crouched, examining something on the forest floor that the others had walked past without noticing. "What is it?" Sarah asked, pushing her glasses up her sweat-slicked nose. The guide said nothing, just brushed away leaves to reveal a perfectly straight line cut into the earth, too precise to be natural. As they watched, he cleared more area, exposing what appeared to be a geometric pattern. "This isn't indigenous," Carlos said finally, his voice tight. "This isn't anything I recognize." James knelt beside him, his knees protesting the movement. The pattern was indeed unlike anything in the archaeological record of the Amazon. Rigid angles and perfect circles pressed into the soil, as if stamped there by machinery rather than human hands. "It's recent," Maya observed. "These marks would have washed away in the first heavy rain, or they're being maintained," James muttered. They followed the pattern, clearing jungle as they went, until it led them to a small clearing dominated by a stone unlike any they'd seen in the region, dark, almost black, with a polished surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Obsidian," Sarah breathed. "But there shouldn't be volcanic glass here. The nearest volcanic activity is hundreds of miles away." The stone stood about waist high, its surface carved with symbols that resembled no known writing system. At its base lay a small obsidian dagger, its blade gleaming despite what must have been centuries of exposure. James reached for it, but Carlos caught his wrist. "Careful, Professor. In my village, we have stories about black stones that drink blood." "Superstition," James replied, though he couldn't entirely dismiss the chill that ran down his spine. He lifted the dagger carefully. It was impossibly light, the blade so thin it nearly disappeared when viewed edge-on. Yet when he carefully tested it against a leaf, it sliced through without resistance. "This craftsmanship," he murmured, examining the hilt. "There are engravings here smaller than a human hair could make." Sarah leaned in, squinting. "Those aren't decorative patterns. They're logographic symbols, like early writing." "Can you read them?" Maya asked. Sarah shook her head. "I've never seen anything like this. It doesn't connect to any known language family." Bobby had been filming the entire discovery. "University's going to love this," he said. "Unexplained artifacts always drive grant funding." That night, they camped near the stone marker, the dagger carefully wrapped and stored in James' specimen case. The jungle's usual cacophony seemed subdued, as if the wildlife was giving their camp a wide berth. "I don't like this place," Carlos said as they sat around the fire. "It feels watched." "The indigenous tribes likely considered this a sacred site," Sarah offered. "The geometric patterns could be ritual boundaries. No indigenous tribe I know of works obsidian with that level of precision," James countered. The micron-level engravings would require tools they simply didn't possess. So what are you suggesting? Maya challenged. Some lost advanced civilization. I'm not suggesting anything yet, James said, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. But tomorrow we follow those markings deeper, see where they lead. That night, James dreamt of black stone corridors and whispered languages he almost understood. He woke just before dawn, his hand clutching the specimen case containing the dagger. Though he had no memory of retrieving it from their secured equipment, the compass around his neck was warm to the touch, its needle spinning in slow, deliberate circles. Something's not right, Carlos said, staring at the darkening sky. This weather, it's wrong for the season. James followed the guide's gaze upward. Through gaps in the canopy, clouds had gathered with unnatural speed, their underbellies a sickly green-gray. The air felt charged, heavy with electricity and the promise of violence. How far to the next clearing? James asked, checking his GPS. The signal had been weakening progressively over the past 2 days, another anomaly in a growing list. 2 hours, maybe 3, Carlos replied. But we won't make it before this hits. As if summoned by his words, the first fat droplets began to fall, striking leaves with audible impacts. Within minutes, the gentle patter transformed into a roaring deluge that bent branches and turned the ground beneath their feet into treacherous mud. "We need shelter," Sarah shouted over the din, clutching her notebooks to her chest, plastic covering already failing to keep the water at bay. "There," Maya pointed to a slight overhang created by a fallen tree and erosion. "It's not much, but it's something." The team fought their way toward the makeshift shelter, each step becoming more difficult as the jungle floor transformed into a sucking quagmire. They had nearly reached it when the first flash of lightning struck somewhere nearby, the thunderclap instantaneous and deafening. "This isn't a normal storm," Bobby yelled, his camera equipment bundled against his chest. "It's like a hurricane and a thunderstorm had a baby." James had experienced monsoons before, but something about this felt targeted, almost deliberate in its fury. The wind changed direction without warning, driving rain horizontally into their faces, then abruptly shifting to tear at their backs. They huddled beneath the overhang, watching as small streams formed, then merged into rushing torrents all around them. The water level was rising with alarming speed. "We can't stay here," Carlos said, eyeing the swelling current that threatened to reach their position. "We need higher ground." The ridge, James pointed to a rocky outcropping visible through the curtain of rain. "If we can reach that, we'll be above the floodplain." "It's too far," Sarah protested. "We'll be completely exposed." "We don't have a choice," James said, gathering his pack. "On my signal, we move together." "Stay close!" They broke from their shelter, immediately drenched by the punishing downpour. The ground had become a shallow river, the current strong enough to tug at their ankles. They struggled forward as a group, each person keeping visual contact with the next. They were halfway to the ridge when disaster struck. A massive section of saturated earth gave way upstream, sending a wall of mud and debris cascading toward them. "Run!" Carlos screamed, pushing Sarah ahead of him. James watched in horror as the mudslide bore down on them. Maya and Bobby made it past him toward higher ground, but Carlos and Sarah were directly in its path. "This way!" James shouted, gesturing frantically toward a different route. In the chaos, his voice was lost. He saw Carlos shove Sarah clear before the mudslide engulfed him. Sarah screamed, scrambling away as the torrent of earth carried Carlos into the newly formed river below. James lunged toward a thick liana hanging from a nearby tree, extending his hand toward Sarah. "Grab on!" Their fingers touched, slipped, caught again, and then the ground beneath James collapsed. He felt himself falling, tumbling through a confusion of mud, vegetation, and water. Something hard struck his temple, and darkness swarmed his vision. When consciousness returned, the world had transformed. The rain had stopped, though water still dripped from leaves overhead. James lay half buried in mud, his body aching in places he hadn't known could hurt. "Maya!" he called, his voice a hoarse croak. "Bobby! Sarah!" Only the jungle answered, its normal sounds resuming as if the apocalyptic storm had never happened. James struggled to free himself, eventually managing to stand on unsteady legs. His pack was gone, along with most of his equipment. The compass still hung around his neck, caked with mud but intact. Something glinted in the mud nearby. James staggered toward it, dropping to his knees to excavate what appeared to be a stone disc, partially fractured. As he cleaned it, he discovered precisely drilled holes arranged in concentric patterns. When he held it up, sunlight pierced through the holes, creating a pattern on his palm that resembled star formations. James looked around, realizing he had no idea where the ridge was, where his team had gone, or even which direction would lead back to their original trail. He was completely, utterly alone. The first 3 days alone were the hardest. James's leg throbbed where a jagged branch had torn through his pants during the mudslide, leaving a 6-inch gash that oozed whenever he moved. His pack was gone, and with it most of his supplies. All he had was the fractured stone disc, his mud-caked compass, a small utility knife, and the clothes on his back. Water, at least, was abundant after the storm. Food was another matter. His academic knowledge of edible plants proved dangerously theoretical when facing actual survival. The first berries he attempted left him vomiting for hours, huddled against a tree trunk. Fever dreams blurring the boundary between consciousness and delirium. On the 4th day, James fashioned a crude walking stick and began methodically searching for signs of his team. He called their names until his voice gave out, then resorted to whistling patterns they had established for emergencies. The jungle swallowed every sound with indifferent silence. His leg worsened. Red streaks crept upward from the wound, infection setting in despite his attempts to clean it with rainwater. By nightfall, he could barely put weight on it. Shelter became a hollow beneath an ancient kapok tree, its massive roots creating natural walls that offered some protection. "Think, James," he muttered to himself, voice cracking from dehydration despite the humid air. "Use that supposedly brilliant mind of yours." In his more lucid moments, he maintained a mental map of his movements, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to orient himself. The compass needle spun erratically, as if confused by some magnetic anomaly in the region. The GPS had been lost with his pack, and even if he'd had it, the signal had been unreliable for days before the storm. On the 6th night, fever raging, James crawled deeper into the hollow to escape a sudden downpour. His hand brushed against something cool and soft in the darkness. Blinching back, he squinted, then stared in wonder as the object began to glow with a gentle blue-green light. Fungi. But unlike any he'd seen before. The cluster pulsed softly, illuminating the hollow with ethereal light. Most remarkable was their arrangement. Not the random organic sprawl typical of mushrooms, but precise hexagonal patterns, each fungus equidistant from its neighbors. In his feverish state, James found this geometrical perfection mesmerizing. He reached out, touching one gently. It released a fine powder that sparkled in the glow. Acting on instinct, or perhaps desperation, he took some of the powder and pressed it into his infected wound. The relief was immediate and shocking. A cool sensation spread through his leg, numbing the pain that had been his constant companion. James slumped back, suddenly exhausted beyond measure, and fell into the first deep sleep he'd had since the storm. He awoke to sunlight filtering through the roots and a strange clarity of mind. The infection in his leg had visibly receded. The angry red streaks faded to pink. The fungi still glowed faintly, though their light was harder to see in the daylight. "Impossible," James whispered, examining his partially healed wound. He carefully collected some of the fungi, wrapping them in a large leaf. Whether miracle or hallucination, he wasn't about to leave them behind. With renewed strength, James constructed a more systematic approach to survival. He built a small shelter near a stream, marked trails with broken branches, and created a rudimentary map on a piece of bark, using the sun's position to maintain orientation. Finding food became easier once he discovered which plants the local monkeys ate. He avoided the berries that had sickened him and focused on nuts, certain leaves, and occasionally, when desperate enough, grubs and insects that made his academic sensibilities recoil even as they kept him alive. By the end of the second week, James had established a routine. Mornings for water collection and foraging, afternoons for exploration and searching for his team, evenings for tending his shelter and examining his finds by the light of the strange fungi, which continued to thrive in the wrapped leaf. He began keeping a journal on large leaves, using a sharpened stick and berry juice as ink. The entries became his connection to sanity, a way to organize his thoughts and observations as days stretched into weeks. Day 16, he wrote one evening. No sign of the others. The storm seems to have altered the landscape significantly. I keep finding unusual stone fragments with the same precise drilling as the disc. They appear to be leading somewhere. Tomorrow, I will follow them more systematically. The fungi continue to exhibit properties that defy conventional biology. They grow in perfect patterns and seem to respond to proximity to the stone fragments. There is a connection here I'm missing. Perhaps it's time to stop searching for my team and start searching for answers instead. Day 23 in the jungle. James had stopped counting the hours, focusing instead on the rhythms of light and dark, rain and dry, hunger and satiation. His body had adapted to his new reality with surprising resilience. The wound on his leg had healed to a puckered pink scar, thanks to regular applications of the luminescent fungal powder. This morning, James rose before dawn and packed his meager possessions, the compass, stone disc, fungal cluster, and a crude bag woven from plant fibers containing his food reserves. Today he would follow the stone fragments more systematically than his previous half-hearted attempts. The first fragment lay where he had originally found it, half buried in mud about 50 yards from his shelter. Its positioning seemed almost deliberate, as if placed rather than scattered by natural forces. James had noted similar fragments during his earlier explorations, but always dismissed them as coincidental. Now, viewing them through the lens of intentionality, a pattern emerged. Each fragment lay roughly 30 paces from the last, forming a winding path through the jungle. James followed methodically, marking each location on his bark map. By midday, he had tracked 7 fragments, the path leading steadily eastward, slightly uphill. The vegetation grew denser, forcing him to hack through with his makeshift machete, a sharpened piece of hardwood that dulled quickly but served its purpose. The 8th fragment differed from the others. Larger and partially exposed, it featured the same precise drilling, but also bore markings similar to those on the obsidian dagger his team had discovered before the separation. James knelt, brushing away centuries of accumulated soil. Not a fragment, he murmured to himself, a habit from weeks of solitude. A marker, he began excavating around the stone, careful not to damage any potential inscriptions. Hours passed as he dug, the sun tracking overhead until it began its descent toward the horizon. Just as the light started to fade, his fingers brushed against something solid beneath the marker, more stone, but smoother, with a different texture. James worked faster, clearing earth until he revealed what appeared to be a capstone, a flat, circular piece approximately 3 feet in diameter. Unlike the rough stones around it, this bore the unmistakable signs of deliberate craftsmanship, perfectly smooth surfaces, precise edges and intricate symbols etched into its periphery. Impossible, James whispered, tracing the symbols with dirt-encrusted fingers. These are mathematical notations, fractional expressions. With trembling hands, he searched for a way to lift or move the capstone. Near its center, he found a small depression that seemed designed for leverage. Inserting his walking stick, he applied pressure. The stone rotated smoothly, as if its underside contained bearings, revealing a dark space beneath. James peered into the opening, his excitement tempered by caution. Too many archaeological traps had claimed careless explorers over the centuries. He lowered an improvised torch, a branch wrapped with resin-soaked fibers, into the darkness. The chamber below was small, perhaps 5 feet square, its walls lined with the same smooth stone as the capstone. It contained only a single object, a cylindrical arrangement of crystals held together by a lattice of unknown material. After testing the stability of the opening, James carefully lowered himself into the chamber. The crystalline object stood about 15 inches tall, comprising different-colored minerals arranged in concentric layers. A small channel ran through its center, opening at both the top and bottom. James recognized some of the crystals: quartz, obsidian, and what appeared to be jade, but others were unfamiliar. Their colors and structures, unlike anything in his geological knowledge. Acting on a hunch, James removed his water container, a hollowed gourd, and poured a small amount of turbid stream water into the top opening of the crystal cylinder. He watched in amazement as the water trickled down through the crystal layers, emerging from the bottom completely clear. He caught some in his hand, lifting it to his lips. The taste was extraordinary, sweet and mineral-rich, like the purest mountain spring. More than refreshing, it felt invigorating, sending a pleasant warmth through his body. "A water filter," he said, voice echoing in the small chamber. "But how? And why here, hidden like this?" As the sun set outside, James made a decision. He would camp beside the chamber tonight and examine the artifact more thoroughly in the morning light. Whatever this was, it was no natural formation. It was technology, sophisticated, purposeful technology, in a place where none should exist. In his leaf journal that night, illuminated by his glowing fungi, James wrote, "I believe I've found the first piece of a larger puzzle. This isn't just some lost tribe or unknown indigenous culture. This is something else entirely, something that changes everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian civilization. And I'm only just beginning to uncover it." Dawn broke with unusual clarity, as if the jungle itself held its breath in anticipation. James had slept fitfully beside the open chamber. Dreams filled with mathematical symbols and crystalline structures that seemed to communicate in a language just beyond his comprehension. The crystalline water filter had continued working through the night, producing a small pool of perfectly clear water at its base. James drank deeply, noting again the unusual vitality that spread through his body afterward. With his canteen refilled, he packed the filter carefully in his improvised bag. Whatever this civilization had been, he wouldn't leave their technology buried any longer. Following his instincts and the increasingly erratic behavior of his compass, James continued eastward, climbing steadily higher. The stone fragments appeared with greater frequency now, some bearing the same mathematical notations he'd seen on the capstone. By midday, the vegetation began to change subtly. Vines grew in suspiciously straight lines. Trees appeared to have been guided rather than growing naturally, their trunks forming patterns too regular for chance. Most telling were the root systems. Many exposed roots ran horizontally before plunging downward, as if they'd encountered an underground structure they couldn't penetrate. "It's here," James whispered, running his hand along a particularly geometric arrangement of exposed roots. "Something's beneath us." He began probing the ground methodically, using his walking stick to test for hollow spaces. After an hour of careful examination, a different sound echoed back, not the dull thud of packed earth, but a resonant tap suggesting space beneath. James dropped to his knees, clearing away accumulated soil and vegetation. Beneath lay what appeared to be a large stone slab, its surface worn by centuries, but still bearing faint traces of the same symbols he'd encountered before. Unlike the capstone, this slab had no obvious mechanism for opening. James worked his way around its perimeter, searching for a seam or lever. Near what he estimated to be the northeast corner, his fingers found a small depression, similar to the one on the capstone, but differently shaped. A key, he realized, removing the fractured stone disc from his pocket. The broken edge matched the depression perfectly. When he inserted the disc, nothing happened immediately. Then, responding perhaps to the pressure or some mechanism triggered by the specific shape, the ground began to vibrate subtly. A fine line appeared in the soil surrounding the slab as it rose slightly, revealing darkness beneath. James hesitated, remembering tales of temple traps and booby-trapped tombs. But curiosity, the driving force of his entire career, overcame caution. He positioned himself at the edge of the opening and lowered his torch into the void. The flickering light revealed a short stone staircase descending about 10 feet to what appeared to be a landing. The craftsmanship was immaculate, each step perfectly level, the walls smooth to the touch. This was no crude construction, but precision stonework that would challenge modern masons. "Hello." James called down, his voice echoing strangely. The echo was wrong. Instead of fading, it seemed to amplify, resonating with a clarity that defied the normal properties of sound. James took a deep breath and began his descent. The stone disc clutched tightly in one hand, torch in the other. The stairs opened onto a small circular chamber about 15 feet in diameter, its walls, floor, and ceiling forming a perfect sphere. No seams were visible between stones. The entire room appeared to have been carved from a single massive boulder, a feat impossible with any known ancient technology. Most remarkable was the acoustic property of the space. Even James's breathing seemed magnified, each inhalation and exhalation returning to him with crystalline clarity. When he spoke, the words didn't just echo but seemed to sustain themselves, hovering in the air. "Remarkable," he said, the word bouncing around him like a living thing. In the center of the chamber floor stood a small pedestal with a concave depression. James approached it cautiously. The depression matched the curved bottom of the stone disc. When he placed the disc into position, something extraordinary happened. A voice, distant yet perfectly clear, spoke in an unknown language. James jerked back, heart pounding. The voice continued, seeming to emanate from the disc itself. Though he couldn't understand the words, the cadence suggested a message, not random sounds, but deliberate communication. Then, just as suddenly, silence returned. James approached the pedestal again, examining it more carefully. Small channels radiated outward from the central depression, cutting through the floor and disappearing into the walls. These weren't decorative, but functional, acoustic waveguides, he realized, designed to channel sound to... "Where? An ancient communication system," he whispered, the implications staggering. In the torch's flickering light, James noticed another opening on the far side of the chamber, a dark archway leading deeper into whatever structure lay hidden beneath the jungle floor. James stood at the threshold of the archway, torch extended into the darkness beyond. His academic training urged caution, document everything, proceed methodically. But a deeper instinct, something almost primal, pulled him forward into the unknown. The passage beyond the acoustic chamber narrowed briefly, its walls pressing in before opening abruptly onto something that stole his breath. A vast chamber stretched before him, so large his torch couldn't illuminate its boundaries. The air was cool and dry, impossibly preserved after what must have been centuries of abandonment. "My God," James whispered, his voice small in the vastness. He moved forward cautiously, torch held high. The floor was smooth stone, polished to a mirror-like finish. His footsteps made no sound, as if the material absorbed all impact. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed something odd about the walls. They weren't solid, but covered in what appeared to be writing. No, not just writing. Equations. James approached the nearest wall section. What he had mistaken for decorative patterns from a distance resolved into precise mathematical notations, complex formulas that reminded him of advanced calculus and theoretical physics, subjects far outside his archaeological expertise. Yet he recognized enough to be stunned. "These are differential equations," he murmured, running his fingers over the deeply incised symbols. "And here, orbital mechanics. Impossible." The wall stretched dozens of feet high, every inch covered with these mathematical inscriptions, organized in meticulous columns and rows. Some formulas contained symbols he couldn't identify, variables in an unknown notation system. Others were accompanied by diagrams showing celestial objects, their movements tracked with precision that would require telescopes to calculate. "This civilization predates Newton by millennia," James said to the empty chamber. "This knowledge shouldn't exist here." His torch flickered, reminding him of its limited lifespan. He needed better light to properly document this discovery. As if responding to his thought, his foot struck something on the floor, a raised circular platform about 3 feet in diameter. In its center stood a peculiar arrangement of metallic spheres suspended on thin rods, balanced in concentric orbits around a central axis. The entire apparatus was about 2 feet tall, its metal untarnished despite the centuries. James circled it cautiously, recognizing elements of the equations from the walls in its physical design. The arrangement of spheres corresponded to diagrams etched nearby, what appeared to be a model of celestial mechanics. Almost reverently, he reached out and touched one of the outer spheres, setting it in gentle motion. The sphere began to orbit, and as it moved, it triggered the movement of others in sequence. Within moments, the entire apparatus was in motion, spheres rotating around one another in complex, synchronized patterns. Then, astonishingly, it began to glow. A soft blue-white light emanated from the core of the device, growing steadily brighter as the spheres continued their motion. Soon it illuminated the entire chamber with a steady, shadowless radiance that revealed the true scale of the room. James stepped back in awe. The chamber was circular, perhaps 100 feet in diameter, its ceiling a perfect dome rising 50 feet above. The walls, now fully visible, were indeed covered entirely with mathematical formulas and astronomical charts of extraordinary sophistication. At regular intervals around the perimeter stood more of the spherical devices, each slightly different in configuration. As the light from the first spread, these too began to activate, spheres moving of their own accord, adding their illumination until the chamber blazed with light bright enough to read by, yet producing no heat. "Kinetic energy conversion," James breathed, the implications staggering. They developed technology to convert motion directly into light. In the center of the chamber, previously hidden in darkness, stood a raised dais. Upon it rested what appeared to be a control panel of some kind, a flat stone surface inlaid with crystal touch points arranged in geometric patterns. James approached it slowly, his mind reeling. This wasn't just an archaeological find. It was a technological impossibility, a civilization that possessed scientific knowledge and engineering capabilities that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. He studied the panel, noting how the crystal points corresponded to diagrams on the walls. Some intuition told him this was just the beginning, that this chamber was merely an antechamber to something far more significant. "Who were you?" he asked the absent builders. "And what else did you know that history has forgotten?" The glowing orbs continued their silent dance, illuminating mathematical knowledge that had been hidden from humanity for thousands of years. In their light, James could see additional passages leading deeper into the complex, each promising further revelations. He took out his leaf journal and began to sketch furiously, trying to capture the equations before exploring further. Whatever he had discovered here would rewrite history if he could live to tell about it. James approached the crystal control panel cautiously, his archaeological training warring with overwhelming curiosity. Each crystal touchpoint glowed with subtle internal light, arranged in patterns that echoed the mathematical formulas on the walls. "A user interface," he murmured, recognizing the underlying logic despite its alien design. But for what system? He hovered his hand over the panel, not quite touching it. The nearest crystals brightened in response, tracking his movement. Whatever technology powered this place, it remained functional after centuries, perhaps millennia, of abandonment. Steeling himself, James pressed a crystal that seemed to correspond to a doorway symbol recurring in the wall equations. The response was immediate. A section of the seemingly solid wall parted silently, revealing a previously hidden passage. "Incredible," he whispered. Approaching the opening, The new passage was shorter than the previous one, leading to a smaller chamber with a distinctly different purpose. Where the main room had been dominated by mathematics and astronomy, this space was dedicated to what appeared to be information storage. Recessed into the walls were hundreds of hexagonal niches, each containing a crystal similar to those in the control panel but larger, roughly the size of his palm. They were arranged in a honeycomb pattern from floor to ceiling, their surfaces etched with minute patterns visible only when light struck at certain angles. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, supporting a more complex arrangement of the crystals, a three-dimensional matrix suspended within a metallic frame. The individual crystals within the matrix were interconnected by thin filaments of an unknown material, creating a structure reminiscent of molecular models James had seen in university chemistry departments. Fascinated, he approached the matrix. Unlike the wall crystals, these were actively glowing, pulsing with gentle rhythms as if exchanging information. When he moved closer, the pulses intensified, responding to his presence. Some kind of data storage system, James theorized aloud, his voice helping to organize his thoughts in the overwhelming strangeness. But how did they read it? As if answering his question, a beam of light shot from the top of the pedestal, projecting a three-dimensional image into the air above the matrix. James stumbled back in shock, nearly falling. The projection showed a human figure, or something very close to human, dressed in unfamiliar garments. The figure began to speak in the same unknown language James had heard in the acoustic chamber. Though he couldn't understand the words, the figure's gestures seemed instructional, pointing to various parts of the matrix and demonstrating a specific sequence of touches and manipulations. The presentation had the distinct feel of a tutorial. When the figure finished speaking, the projection shifted to display what appeared to be a catalogue or index, rows of symbols organized in hierarchical groups, hovering in midair with a clarity no modern hologram could match. "My God," James breathed. "It's a library." The implications staggered him. This wasn't just a temple or monument, but a repository of knowledge, a database of information stored in crystal matrices using technology humanity had yet to develop. Acting on instinct, James reached toward one of the symbols in the projection. His hand passed through it, but the system reacted nonetheless. The matrix rearranged itself, crystals shifting position as the projection changed to display new information. Images flashed before him, detailed anatomical diagrams of plants and animals, some familiar, others extinct or unknown. These were followed by what appeared to be genetic sequences, molecular structures, and medical procedures far beyond ancient capabilities. James tried another symbol. The display shifted to show geographical information, detailed maps of coastlines that didn't quite match modern continents, suggesting extreme age. Overlaid on these were migration patterns, resource distributions, and climate models, showing environmental changes over vast time periods. They were scientists, James realized. This civilization wasn't built on superstition or religious dogma. It was founded on empirical knowledge. He spent hours exploring the crystal library, triggering different projections, photographing them with his mind as best he could. The scope of knowledge was overwhelming: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, biology, geology, physics, all preserved in these crystalline matrices. One crystal in particular caught his attention, slightly different in coloration than the others. When he selected it in the interface, the projection showed something unexpected: images of cataclysm, cities crumbling, oceans rising, what appeared to be mass migration. The final image was the most disturbing: a map showing the global spread of these crystal repositories, hidden in remote locations across every continent. This wasn't just a library, it was one node in a worldwide network of knowledge preservation. They knew they were facing extinction, James whispered. This wasn't built as a monument to their greatness. It was an ark designed to preserve their knowledge. through whatever catastrophe they saw coming. The question that haunted him as he finally tore himself away to explore deeper was simple yet profound. What had happened to wipe such an advanced civilization from human history so completely that not even myths remained? Time lost meaning in the depths of the temple. James had no way of knowing whether it was day or night above ground, and his wristwatch had stopped working the moment he'd entered the crystal library. He'd explored chamber after chamber, each revealing technologies and knowledge that defied historical understanding. His body demanded rest, but his mind refused to slow. Consuming water from the crystalline filter and the nutrient-rich fungi he'd collected, he pressed onward, following a sequence of symbols that recurred throughout the complex, what he'd come to recognize as directional markers. The passage beyond the library ascended gradually, spiraling upward through the bedrock. As he climbed, James noticed a change in the air, a freshness suggesting proximity to the surface. The walls here bore fewer equations and more celestial charts, star positions mapped with impossible precision. The passage terminated in a circular metal door, unlike anything he'd seen in the complex. No visible handle or mechanism offered a way forward. James examined it carefully, noting 7 small depressions arranged in an arc across its surface. A combination lock, he muttered, studying the depressions. Each was shaped differently, suggesting specific keys. He backtracked mentally through the chambers he'd explored, remembering various small objects he'd noticed but left behind. 7 chambers, 7 artifacts. It couldn't be coincidence. Retracing his steps, James gathered the items. The fractured stone disc, a small crystal from the library, a metallic sphere from the kinetic lamp, and 4 other objects from rooms he'd explored. When placed in their corresponding depressions, they fit perfectly. The door opened silently, revealing a space unlike any he'd encountered. He stood at the threshold of what appeared to be an observatory, but one designed with principles far beyond ancient astronomy. The circular chamber was approximately 50 feet in diameter, its ceiling a perfect dome of what appeared to be glass or crystal, offering an unobstructed view of the night sky above. The jungle canopy that should have blocked this view was mysteriously absent, as if the chamber had somehow risen above the trees. "Impossible," James whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the space. Dominating the center of the room was an apparatus that defied easy description. A series of crystalline discs, each perfectly transparent, yet etched with concentric patterns, hung suspended in mid-air, arranged along a central axis. They rotated slowly, maintaining their position without any visible means of support. Surrounding this central feature were 7 smaller pedestals, each supporting control interfaces similar to those in the main chamber, but more specialized. Star charts covered the walls, showing not just Earth's view of the cosmos, but perspectives that seemed to originate from different vantage points entirely. Views of the galaxy. "Impossible from our planet's position," James approached one of the pedestals cautiously. Its surface displayed what appeared to be a representation of our solar system, planets arrayed around the sun, with orbits traced in glowing lines. When he touched the interface, the central disk array responded, its components shifting position slightly. A beam of light shot from the array's apex, striking the crystal ceiling. But rather than stopping there, it somehow penetrated, projecting onto the night sky itself. A circle of light appeared among the stars, magnifying a specific region to show details invisible to the naked eye, surface features of Mars, rendered with perfect clarity. "A telescope," James breathed. "But not like any we've ever created." He experimented with the interface, finding he could target different celestial bodies. Each selection reconfigured the floating disks, somehow bending light, or perhaps something more fundamental than light, to magnify distant objects. When he selected a distant star system, the projection showed not just the stars, but orbiting planets invisible to modern telescopes. They weren't just tracking the stars, he realized. They were mapping the entire galaxy. cataloging other worlds. Notes beside the interface contained what appeared to be data about these planets, atmospheric composition, surface conditions, even potential habitability. Some entries included dates, observations spanning thousands of years, tracking changes over time, scales no single civilization should have been able to record. Most disturbing were symbols he'd seen repeated throughout the complex, associated with specific star systems, symbols that appeared to indicate visitation or contact. The implications were too extreme to contemplate rationally. As James moved around the observatory, he noticed something odd about the floor. Unlike the solid stone of other chambers, this one contained circular sections of different material, metal plates approximately 3 feet in diameter, arranged in patterns corresponding to major star systems. When he stepped onto one accidentally, it depressed slightly under his weight. The disk array immediately reconfigured, focusing on that specific star system with unprecedented clarity. But something more happened. A sensation of vertigo overtook him, a momentary feeling of movement, though he remained physically stationary. For a fleeting second, James would have sworn he was seeing that distant star system not as a magnified image, but as if present there himself, a perspective impossible to explain. He staggered back, off the plate, and the sensation immediately ceased. What were they doing here? He whispered to the empty chamber. What were they capable of? The silent stars offered no answer, but the technology arrayed before him suggested possibilities far beyond conventional archaeology or conventional physics. Whatever built this place hadn't just been studying the stars. They had been reaching for them. Sleep finally claimed James on the observatory floor, his exhausted body overriding his racing mind. He dreamt of stars and equations, crystalline voices speaking in languages beyond human comprehension. When he woke, his first disoriented thought was that he'd dreamt the entire discovery. The rotating disk array above him confirmed otherwise. His academic mind had begun to organize the findings, attempting to construct a coherent narrative from the impossible technology surrounding him. Whatever civilization had built, this place possessed knowledge thousands of years ahead of their time, or perhaps developed along entirely different technological paths than human history had followed. After refreshing himself with water from the crystal filter, James decided to explore the one passage he hadn't yet investigated, a narrow corridor leading downward from the main chamber. Unlike the other passages, this one bore warning symbols, repeated at regular intervals along its length. Probably the best reason to go this way, he murmured to himself. The sound of his own voice, a comfort in the ancient silence. The corridor descended steeply, cut directly through bedrock with precision that would challenge modern mining equipment. After nearly 100 feet, it opened into a chamber different from all the others, a workshop or laboratory of some kind. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces marked with the residue of ancient experiments. Tools hung on racks, implements whose purposes James could only guess at, though some resembled modern precision instruments. Diagrams covered the walls, showing molecular structures and material compositions alongside engineering schematics. In the center stood what appeared to be a forge, but unlike any James had seen. No signs of burning or conventional heating were visible. Instead, a series of crystalline rods surrounded a central platform, arranged to focus energy toward its center. On the platform lay a small pool of metallic material, silvery blue and reflective, somehow maintaining its position without a container. It reminded James of mercury, but seemed more viscous, its surface occasionally rippling, as if responding to unseen stimuli. Nearby, a control panel similar to those in other chambers offered an interface. James approached cautiously, studying the symbols. They matched diagrams on the walls related to metallurgy and material science. This was some kind of material engineering laboratory. Curiosity overcoming caution, James activated the panel. The crystalline rods surrounding the forge began to glow, emitting no heat but causing the silvery blue material to respond immediately. It shifted, flowing like liquid while maintaining cohesion, forming shapes that corresponded to patterns displayed on the panel. "Programmable matter," James whispered in awe. He selected another pattern. The material reconfigured again, this time forming a small, perfectly crafted tool resembling a screwdriver. When the energy field deactivated, the tool maintained its shape, hardening to what appeared to be metal. James picked it up cautiously. It was lighter than it looked, but incredibly strong. When he deliberately bent it with significant force, the material yielded, then, astonishingly, straightened itself when released, returning to its original form. "Self-healing metal," he breathed. "Imagine the applications." Further experimentation revealed more properties. The material conducted electricity, but could also store it. It responded to temperature changes by altering its molecular structure. Most remarkably, when damaged, it could be reset by the energy field and reprogrammed into new forms without degradation. Among the diagrams on the walls, James found schematics for larger applications, structures, vehicles, and devices that utilize this programmable metal as a core component. Many of these designs incorporated principles he'd seen in other chambers: the gravitational manipulation from the observatory, the energy conversion from the kinetic lamps, the information storage from the crystal library. This wasn't just a single breakthrough technology, but an entire integrated technological ecosystem, developed by a civilization that had mastered material science at a molecular level. As James explored the laboratory, he discovered finished artifacts, small devices created from the programmable metal. Their functions mysterious, but their craftsmanship flawless. One in particular caught his attention, a disc about 4 inches in diameter with a complex pattern etched into its surface. When he picked it up, it activated at his touch, the pattern reconfiguring slightly to form what appeared to be a map. It took him a moment to recognize the geography, a perfect representation of the region, showing the temple's location and some distance away. A larger structure. James checked his compass instinctively, then remembered its erratic behavior. The metal disc, however, seemed to function as a more sophisticated navigation device, a pointer extending from its edge to indicate direction. "There's more," he realized. "This complex isn't isolated. It's connected to something bigger." The implications sent his mind racing. If this hidden workshop contained technology this advanced, what might be found in the larger structure indicated on the map? And why separate them? The warning symbols along the corridor suddenly seemed more significant. Perhaps this workshop wasn't meant to be found by casual visitors. Perhaps it contained knowledge deemed too dangerous for unrestricted access. As James pocketed the metal disc, he felt a weight beyond its physical presence. Each discovery pushed human history further from accepted narratives. Each artifact challenged not just archaeological consensus, but fundamental assumptions about human technological development. And somewhere nearby, if the map was accurate, waited something even more significant. James knew he couldn't stay in the temple forever. Despite the miraculous water filter and edible fungi, his body was weakening from inadequate nutrition. More pressing was his responsibility to document and share these discoveries, assuming he could find his way back to civilization. Gathering the most portable artifacts, the water filter, the navigation disc, and several smaller items, James prepared to leave. He'd spent what he estimated to be 4 days exploring the complex, though without functioning timepieces. He couldn't be certain. His leaf journal now contained dozens of pages of observations, diagrams, and notes. Though crude compared to proper scientific documentation, it would have to suffice until he could return with a proper team. Assuming anyone believed him, the navigation disc guided him through the temple's labyrinthine passages back to the entrance. The stone steps that had led him into this wonder still ascended into darkness, the jungle's filtered light visible at their peak, just as he prepared to climb. Something caught his eye, a small alcove beside the entrance, previously unnoticed. Unlike the temple's other chambers, this space contained what appeared to be personal effects. A small, sleeping platform, writing implements, and what might have been food preparation tools. Someone lived here, James realized. A caretaker, perhaps. Among these items sat a pair of identical devices, pyramidal in shape, constructed from the same self-repairing metal he'd discovered in the workshop. Each was about the size of his palm, their surfaces inscribed with familiar mathematical equations. When he picked one up, it activated at his touch, emitting a soft blue glow from within. The second pyramid immediately responded with matching illumination, though he hadn't touched it. Curious, James set the first pyramid down and moved the second several feet away. When he touched one, both reacted simultaneously. He experimented further, covering one completely with his pack. The connection remained unbroken, both pyramids responding in perfect synchronization. Quantum entanglement, he whispered, recognizing the principle from his limited knowledge of modern physics. Action at a distance without delay. The implications were staggering. Modern science had only recently begun to explore quantum entanglement's potential for communication. Yet here was a working technology, thousands of years old, demonstrating mastery of quantum physics principles that today's scientists were just beginning to understand. James decided to take both pyramids. If they functioned as he suspected, they could prove invaluable, both as evidence and potentially as emergency communication devices. Though he had no idea of their range or limitations, with his collection of artifacts secured, James finally ascended the steps, emerging into the jungle once more. The transition was jarring from the silent, preserved environment of the temple to the humid, cacophonous rainforest. According to the navigation disk, the larger complex lay approximately 15 miles northeast. A significant journey through dense jungle, but manageable if he followed the guidance accurately. James had taken only a few steps when he heard something that froze him in place. Human voices. After weeks of isolation, the sound was almost shocking. "Over here! I see disturbed vegetation." The voice was familiar. James moved cautiously toward it, hardly daring to hope. Through a screen of ferns, he spotted them. A search party wearing the university's expedition colors. At their center stood Maya Chen, looking considerably more disheveled than when he'd last seen her, but unmistakably alive. "Maya," he called, his voice cracking from weeks of minimal use. She spun toward him, disbelief transforming into recognition. "Professor Harrington. My God, you're alive." The reunion was a blur of emotions, relief, questions, explanations. The team had survived the mudslide, but been separated from James. After making their way back to Puerto Esperanza, they'd organized a search party. Though few expected to find him alive after nearly a month, we followed the river downstream, figuring that's where the slide would have carried you, Maya explained. "Found your pack 2 weeks ago. Everyone said we should give up, but no." Her voice trailed off as she took in his appearance, thinner, clothes in tatters, but with an intensity in his eyes she'd never seen before. "What happened to you out there, Professor?" James hesitated. How could he possibly explain what he'd discovered? The temple, the technology, the implications for human history. It would sound like the delusions of a man driven mad by isolation. "I found something, Maya," he said finally. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew." "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, James reached into his makeshift bag and produced the quantum communicator pyramid. It glowed softly in his palm, reacting to his touch. "I can show you better than I can tell you," he said. "But we need to document everything properly. I need cameras, measuring equipment, sample containers, everything we can get." Maya stared at the glowing pyramid, scientific curiosity overriding skepticism. "What is that thing?" "Proof," James said simply. "Proof that everything in our textbooks about ancient civilizations is wrong." As they prepared to return to the base camp, James felt the weight of the navigation disc in his pocket. The larger complex it indicated remained unexplored, a mystery for another expedition. First, he needed to secure the evidence he'd already gathered. What he didn't know was that news of his rescue and rumors of his discovery were already spreading beyond the search party, reaching ears that had been listening for such reports for a very long time. The return to civilization proved more jarring than James had anticipated. After weeks in the temple's pristine silence, Puerto Esperanza's modest bustle felt overwhelming. His senses, heightened by isolation, recoiled from the cacophony of human activity, generators humming, radios crackling, voices competing for attention. The expedition's base camp had been transformed into a makeshift recovery center. A medical tent housed rudimentary equipment for his examination, though James insisted he was fine, just malnourished and exhausted. The team doctor disagreed, noting his unusual vitality given the circumstances. "Your electrolytes should be severely depleted," Dr. Ramirez said, reviewing blood test results with confusion. "Instead, they're perfectly balanced." "And your leg? Maya mentioned you were injured?" James glanced at the fully healed gash, now just a faint pink line. "The jungle has its own medicine," he replied cryptically. While the medical assessment continued, Maya organized the artifacts James had brought back. The quantum communicator pyramids drew particular attention, their synchronous illumination defying explanation. The team photographer documented everything meticulously, while Sarah, the linguist, puzzled over the symbols etched into each item. "These aren't consistent with any known pre-Columbian script," she noted, comparing rubbings she'd taken. "The mathematical precision suggests a formal written language, not primitive pictographs." James watched their excitement with mixed feelings. These fragments, impressive as they were, represented mere trinkets compared to what remained in the temple, a thought that both thrilled and terrified him. The navigation disc, showing the larger complex, remained hidden in his pocket. Some instinct warned him against revealing everything at once. By evening, word of his miraculous survival and unusual discoveries had reached the university sponsors via satellite phone. Instructions came back immediately: secure all artifacts, document everything, and prepare for extraction by helicopter the following day. "They're sending Professor Whitmore himself," Maya told him, eyes wide. "The department chair never does field work anymore." James nodded, unsurprised by the rapid response. These findings warrant senior oversight. That night, unable to sleep in the confines of a proper bed, James sorted through his leaf journal, organizing his notes by chamber and technology type. The inadequacy of his documentation frustrated him. How could crude sketches possibly convey the mathematical complexity of what he'd witnessed? A soft knock interrupted his work. Sarah entered, carrying a small metal case. "Sorry to disturb you, Professor, but I found something you should see." She placed the case on his desk and opened it carefully. Inside lay what appeared to be a glass cylinder about 6 inches long, its surface etched with the now familiar symbols of the temple. Within the cylinder, suspended in clear liquid, floated a small flower, its delicate structure perfectly preserved, colors vivid as if freshly picked. "Where did you find this?" James asked, instantly alert. "It was among the items you brought back, wrapped in leaves," Sarah explained. "At first I thought it was just a specimen container. But look." She pointed to a small display panel on the cylinder's base, illuminated with glowing symbols. "It's maintaining precise environmental controls," she explained. "Temperature, pressure, chemical composition, all regulated to preserve the specimen in perfect stasis. But here's the incredible part." She handed him a printout, results from the carbon dating analysis they'd rushed on the flower. "That's not possible," James whispered, though he knew better than to dismiss the evidence. "According to the tests, the flower was over 15,000 years old. The container is preserving it in a state of suspended animation," Sarah continued, her academic skepticism warring with the undeniable data. "Not dried or fossilized, actually preserved, down to the cellular level. We've never developed technology that can do this. Even our best cryogenic methods cause irreversible damage to organic structures. James studied the container with new appreciation, a biopreservation technology that worked at the molecular level, maintaining organic samples indefinitely without degradation. The scientific applications alone were staggering. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" he asked quietly. Sarah shook her head. "Just the lab technician who ran the dating analysis, and he thinks the machine malfunctioned. I wanted your opinion first. Keep it between us for now," James decided. "This is significant." After Sarah left, James sat contemplating the preservation capsule. Unlike the quantum communicators or water filter, this technology had immediate, obvious applications in the modern world. Medical storage, organ preservation, food supply stability. Its value would be instantly recognizable to corporations and governments alike. No wonder the temple had been hidden so thoroughly. If even one of these technologies reached the outside world prematurely, the consequences could be profound, economically, politically, even militarily. As dawn approached, James made a decision. He would share most of his discoveries but maintain strategic omissions, particularly regarding the temple's location and the navigation disk pointing to the larger complex. Until he better understood who could be trusted, complete disclosure seemed dangerously naive. The distant sound of helicopter rotors confirmed his time for private deliberation had ended. Professor Whitmore and his team had arrived, and with them, James suspected, would come the first hints of the forces that had kept this knowledge buried for thousands of years. Professor Elliot Whitmore was everything James remembered. Impeccably dressed despite the jungle heat, perpetually frowning and radiating the authoritative impatience that had intimidated generations of archaeology students. At 65, he remained the department's most formidable figure, known equally for brilliant scholarship and ruthless academic politics. "Harrington," he acknowledged curtly, not bothering to hide his assessment of James's disheveled state. "Quite the adventure you've had." The base camp had transformed again, now buzzing with new personnel, technicians, security staff, and administrators, all wearing university credentials, but carrying themselves with unusual discipline. They quickly established a perimeter and began processing the artifacts under Whitmore's supervision. James watched uneasily as his discoveries disappeared into specialized containers. The quantum communicator pyramids went into lead-lined cases. The water filter was sealed in a pressurized container. The biopreservation capsule, which Sarah had reluctantly surrendered, received particular attention, transferred by technicians wearing protective gear that seemed excessive for archaeological artifacts. "Your preliminary report is quite imaginative," Whitmore said, reviewing James' notes with thinly veiled skepticism. "An advanced prehistorical civilization with technology exceeding our own. Rather extraordinary claims." "The evidence supports those claims," James replied evenly. "Evidence requires context and rigorous authentication," Whitmore countered. "These artifacts will need extensive laboratory analysis before drawing conclusions. Your isolation and physical trauma may have affected your objectivity." The implication was clear. James's mental state was being questioned. A strategy he'd seen before when inconvenient discoveries threatened established narratives. Meyer approached, interrupting their tense exchange. "Professor Whitmore, the helicopter pilot says we need to leave within the hour. Weather system moving in." "Very well," Whitmore nodded. "Pack everything. Harrington's field notes, journals, photographs, all of it. Nothing remains here. The site itself needs proper documentation," James protested. "A full archaeological survey team will be arranged," Whitmore finished smoothly. "After preliminary analysis confirms your findings warrant further investment. University resources aren't unlimited, Harrington. You know this." James recognized the bureaucratic stonewalling, but decided against open confrontation. Better to seem compliant while figuring out his next move. As the camp dismantled around him, a young technician approached, handing James a satellite phone. "Call for you, Professor." "Embassy staff?" James took it with surprise. Hello? Professor Harrington? The voice was unfamiliar. Thomas Reed, cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Lima. Congratulations on your safe return. I'm calling to coordinate your extraction paperwork. Thank you, but Professor Whitmore's handling all that, James replied, confused by the formality. Of course. Just procedure. One more thing. Could you confirm the GPS coordinates of your discovery? For our regional archaeological database. The question raised immediate red flags. Embassy cultural attachés didn't maintain archaeological databases, and they certainly wouldn't need precise coordinates. I'll have to check my notes, James deflected. They're packed for transport already. No problem, Reed replied smoothly. We'll connect in Lima. As James returned the phone, he noticed one of Whitmore's security personnel watching him intently, a hard-faced woman whose research assistant credentials seemed particularly unconvincing. That evening, as final preparations for departure continued, James slipped away to use the camp's satellite internet connection. A quick search for Thomas Reed, cultural attaché, returned no results for any U.S. embassy in South America. More disturbing was what he found when searching academic databases for similar archaeological anomalies. Promising research suddenly discontinued, expeditions abruptly defunded, careers diverted away from certain regions or time periods. A pattern emerged of systematic academic discouragement around specific archaeological zones worldwide. As he dug deeper, an incoming email notification appeared from Robert Carlson, an old colleague from James' graduate school days, now an investigative journalist specializing in government secrecy. The message was brief. Heard rumors about your discovery. Be careful who you trust. Call me ASAP. Attached was a heavily redacted document labeled Classified Archaeological Anomaly Containment Protocol. Though most of the text was blacked out, certain phrases remained visible. The continued suppression of findings at sites, 12 to 17, and to maintain historical narrative integrity through academic discreditation if necessary. Most disturbing was a paragraph referencing technologies recovered from Site 8 with potential defense applications. James downloaded the document to a small flash drive, then deleted the email. His suspicions were no longer paranoid speculation. Organized forces were actively suppressing archaeological discoveries that contradicted established historical narratives. The question was, why? Simple academic conservatism couldn't explain this level of coordination. The involvement of apparent government agents suggested something far more significant than protecting tenured professors' theories. As he pocketed the flash drive, James spotted Maya watching him from across the camp. Her expression suggested she'd reached similar conclusions about their new colleagues. "Professor," she said, approaching casually, "I was thinking about that tributary we never got to explore before the storm. Shame we won't have time to check it out." Her emphasis on certain words made her meaning clear. She was proposing they make a separate trip to the temple. Another time, perhaps, James replied carefully. Some discoveries need the right context to be properly understood. Maya nodded, understanding passing between them. Whatever forces were mobilizing to control his findings, James wasn't as alone as they might hope. Lima's university laboratory complex hummed with activity, a sharp contrast to the jungle's primal rhythms. 3 days after extraction from Puerto Esperanza, James found himself increasingly isolated despite the crowded facilities. His artifacts had vanished into restricted research areas. His field notes were being processed, and Whitmore had assigned him administrative tasks that kept him away from the actual analysis. The message was clear. His role in the discovery was ending. Professor Harrington, a lab technician, approached his temporary desk. "Professor Whitmore requests your presence in conference room B, authentication briefing." James followed, noting the security personnel positioned throughout the facility. Their university credentials couldn't mask their military bearing. Whatever was happening transcended academic politics. Conference Room B had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Display screens showed scanning results, spectrographic analyses, and molecular structures of various artifacts. Whitmore stood at the center, directing a team of specialists who looked more like government analysts than university researchers. "Ah, Harrington, good." Whitmore nodded. "We're preparing preliminary findings. Your input might be useful for context." James scanned the room, noting the absence of certain artifacts. "Where's the biopreservation capsule? And the quantum communicators?" "Specialized testing," Whitmore replied dismissively. "Now regarding dating analyses, I'd like to see all test results," James interrupted. "As the principal investigator, I should be fully involved in the authentication process." Whitmore's expression hardened. "Your role was discovery, Harrington. Authentication requires specialized expertise and security protocols beyond your clearance." "Clearance," James echoed. "This is an archaeological expedition, not a military operation." The room fell silent. Whitmore glanced at a stone-faced man in the corner, ostensibly another researcher, but clearly something else, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "James," Whitmore said, softening his tone, "these artifacts present unique security concerns. Certain technologies, if authenticated, could have significant implications for national interests. The university has protocols for such situations, protocols you never mentioned during my 20 years with the department," James countered. "They rarely become relevant," Whitmore replied coldly. "Most archaeologists go entire careers without finding anything truly disruptive." The implication hung in the air. James had crossed a line from acceptable archaeological discovery into something else entirely, something that activated systems designed to control information rather than reveal it. As tension built, a commotion outside interrupted them. Sarah burst into the room clutching a laptop, her expression electric with excitement. "Professor Harrington, I've broken it!" she exclaimed, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the tense atmosphere. "The language? I've deciphered its structural components." Whitmore stepped forward. "Dr. Williams, this is a closed session." Sarah barely acknowledged him. "It's a mathematical language," she continued, addressing James directly. "The symbols encode multiple meaning layers simultaneously: linguistic, mathematical, and possibly quantum informational. States." She turned her laptop to show a complex algorithm she'd developed, a linguistic decryption model, correlating temple symbols with mathematical constants and known language patterns. "It's a root language," she explained breathlessly. "Potentially the linguistic precursor to all Indo-European and even Sino-Tibetan language families. The structural similarities are unmistakable once you apply the correct mathematical transformations." James examined her work, immediately recognizing its significance. If Sarah was right, this wasn't just an unknown ancient language. It was potentially the ancestral tongue from which all modern languages evolved. "Have you translated any complete passages?" he asked. "Portions of the astronomical texts," Sarah nodded. "They describe stellar configurations from approximately 15,000 BCE, consistent with the carbon dating. But here's the extraordinary part." "That's enough, Dr. Williams," Whitmore interrupted sharply. "This analysis should proceed through proper channels." Sarah ignored him, showing James another screen. "These passages describe the civilization's origin. They called themselves the Watchers or Guardians. They established sites globally to preserve knowledge through what they foresaw as a coming cataclysm." "Dr. Williams," Whitmore's voice rose, "this material is classified pending security review." "Classified?" Sarah looked up, finally registering the room's tension. "This is linguistic analysis, not military intelligence." The stone-faced man stepped forward. "Dr. Williams, your security clearance has been temporarily suspended. Please surrender your laptop and research materials." Sarah clutched her computer protectively. "This is my work, academic research protected by university policy and academic freedom." "Not anymore," the man replied flatly. James intervened, positioning himself between Sarah and the security team. This is still a university expedition, governed by academic protocols. Any classification decisions require proper review processes. Those processes are underway, Whitmore stated. Meanwhile, all materials relating to the expedition remain under institutional control. Under whose authority? James challenged. National security, the stone-faced man answered, producing credentials James couldn't quite see. These artifacts may have strategic implications, requiring controlled disclosure. The standoff might have escalated further if Maya hadn't chosen that moment to appear at the door. Face flushed with urgency. Professor Harrington, you're needed immediately. There's a situation with one of the artifacts. James recognized the manufactured emergency, but played along. We'll continue this discussion later, he told Whitmore, guiding Sarah toward the door. In the hallway, Maya quickly led them to a service elevator. Your hotel rooms have been searched, she whispered, and they're preparing transport for the artifacts to a military facility tonight. Whatever you found, they're taking it completely out of academic channels. How do you know this? James asked. I have contacts in the logistics department, Maya replied. And I'm not the only one uncomfortable with what's happening. Several researchers are raising concerns about the military presence and classification protocols. Sarah clutched her laptop. We need to secure my decryption model. It's the key to understanding everything about the temple. James nodded grimly. And we need to contact someone I trust before these findings disappear completely. The elevator doors closed, taking them away from the increasingly militarized research facility and toward a confrontation James had hoped to avoid, but now seemed inevitable. We need to go back to the temple, James said. They had regrouped in a small apartment on Lima's outskirts, borrowed from one of Maya's local contacts, a graduate student sympathetic to their cause, but wisely absent during their stay. Sarah worked furiously on backing up her linguistic algorithm to secure cloud storage under encrypted aliases, while Maya monitored university communications through her network of inside sources. Back to the jungle. That's insane, Sarah protested, looking up from her laptop. They'll be watching all access routes to the region. Precisely why we need to move quickly, James countered. Once they realize we've gone off-grid, they'll lock down the entire area. Our window is closing. Robert Carlson, the investigative journalist James had contacted, joined their impromptu council of war via encrypted video call. His normally jovial face was uncharacteristically grave. James, I've been tracking similar incidents for years, he explained. Ancient technologies disappearing into classified programs. Archaeologists pressured into silence or reassignment. What you've discovered fits a pattern dating back decades. But why? Sarah asked. These artifacts are historically significant, but they're primarily of academic value. Carlson shook his head. Based on your descriptions, we're not talking about interesting pottery shards. Quantum communication, molecular preservation, self-repairing metals. These technologies have immediate military and economic applications. Whoever controls them gains tremendous advantage. So this isn't about protecting established historical narratives? James asked. That's just the cover story, Carlson replied. This is about power, technological, military, economic. Certain government factions would rather control these technologies exclusively than allow them to transform society openly. Maya looked up from her phone. My contact says they've scheduled a military transport for tomorrow morning. After that, these artifacts effectively disappear. James made a decision. We leave tonight. The navigation disk shows another complex, potentially larger than what I've already found. If we can document it thoroughly before they find us, create undeniable evidence, and release it publicly, Carlson added. I have secure channels ready when you are. Through Maya's connections, they assembled essential equipment, cameras, sample kits, GPS trackers, satellite phones with untraceable SIM cards. By midnight, they were aboard a private charter flight to Puerto Maldonado, a different entry point to the Amazon than their original expedition had used. James remained tense throughout the flight, expecting intervention at any moment. Yet they landed without incident, transferring immediately to a waiting jeep, driven by another of Maya's seemingly endless supply of sympathetic contacts. "They're monitoring commercial travel and official expedition permits," she explained. "But my friend here runs private eco-tours off the books. We're registered as birdwatchers." The journey back through the jungle was grueling, but faster than James had expected. The navigation disc proved remarkably accurate, guiding them along routes that somehow seemed less dense with vegetation than surrounding areas. It's almost as if these paths were designed to remain partially accessible, James noted as they crossed a stream that perfectly matched the disc's projections. On the fourth day, they reached the temple entrance. To James's relief, it showed no signs of disturbance. The military team hadn't located it yet. They quickly established a base camp and prepared documentation equipment. "We need systematic, thorough evidence," James instructed. "Every artifact, every inscription, every chamber, documented with multiple verification methods. Sarah, focus on translating the most significant inscriptions with your algorithm." Working methodically, they proceeded through the chambers James had explored previously. Sarah applied her linguistic model to the mathematical equations, her translations revealing astonishing insights about the civilization's understanding of physics, biology, and cosmology. In the central chamber, Maya discovered something James had overlooked, a small recess behind one of the kinetic energy lamps. Inside sat a dodecahedral crystal about the size of a tennis ball, its facets inscribed with now familiar mathematical patterns. "Another data storage device?" Sarah suggested, examining it. "Possibly," James agreed. "But the configuration is different from the memory crystals in the library chamber. When Maya lifted it from its recess, the crystal activated immediately. Light emanated from its core, projecting a three-dimensional image into the center of the chamber, a perfect holographic representation of a human figure, except it wasn't entirely human. The figure stood about 7 feet tall, proportioned similarly to Homo sapiens, but with subtle differences: slightly larger cranial structure, more pronounced orbital ridges, elongated fingers with an additional joint. Most striking were the eyes, larger than human norm, with unusual reflective properties. The holographic figure began to speak. Though the words remained unintelligible, Sarah recorded them frantically for later analysis. The figure gestured as if providing instruction, occasionally manipulating holographic objects that appeared within its reach, demonstrating technologies, perhaps, or explaining concepts. After several minutes, the projection changed, showing multiple figures in what appeared to be daily activities within the temple complex. The level of detail was extraordinary: clothing textures, facial expressions, even subtle environmental elements, like dust motes floating in light beams. "My God," Sarah whispered. "It's their historical record, a visual archive of who they were. Not just who," James added, watching intently, "but how they lived, worked, thought. This is beyond anthropological gold. It's direct observation of a civilization that existed before conventional history began." The hologram shifted again, now showing what appeared to be a medical procedure. The tall beings using crystal instruments to manipulate cellular structures, displayed in accompanying projections. "They weren't just technologically advanced," Maya observed. "Their entire approach to science seems fundamentally different from our own, more integrated somehow." James nodded, transfixed by the images. "They didn't separate disciplines the way we do. Physics, biology, information science, all unified in their understanding." The crystal continued projecting for nearly an hour before cycling back to its starting point. By then, all three of them had filled multiple storage drives with video documentation. "This changes everything," Sarah said quietly. "They weren't a lost human civilization. They were something else, something that existed alongside early humans," James added. "Perhaps even interacted with them." The implications hung in the air between them, an entirely new chapter of Earth's history. one that would rewrite every textbook and challenge humanity's understanding of its own origins. What they didn't know was how desperately certain powers wanted that chapter to remain closed. "We need to explore the larger complex," James insisted, studying the navigation disk projections. "According to this, it's only a few miles northeast, a more extensive facility connected to this outpost." Maya frowned, reviewing their dwindling supplies. "We've already gathered substantial evidence. Shouldn't we transmit what we have before risking further exposure?" "We've documented fragments," James countered. "Impressive ones, certainly, but this temple appears to be merely a satellite facility. The main repository likely contains more comprehensive information." Sarah, who had been analyzing the holographic recordings, looked up from her laptop. "James is right. The translations suggest this was an observation post. They refer repeatedly to a primary archive elsewhere." Their debate was cut short by an alert from one of the motion sensors they'd placed around the temple perimeter. Someone was approaching, multiple someones, based on the pattern of activations. "Military?" Sarah whispered, hastily backing up her latest translations. Maya checked the surveillance feed on her tablet. "No uniforms, but they're moving with tactical precision. Private contractors, maybe. How did they find us so quickly?" James wondered, gathering essential equipment. "The charter pilot," Maya realized grimly. "He must have reported our destination. They had minutes at most." James made a quick decision. "Take everything we've documented so far and head for the secondary exit I found, the one leading up through the observatory. I'll lead them away from the temple, then circle back and meet you at the rendezvous point." "That's too risky," Sarah protested. "We can't let them capture all of us or seize our evidence," James insisted. "This is bigger than any individual now." Before further objections could be raised, James grabbed the navigation disk and a small pack of essentials. 72 hours. If I'm not at the rendezvous by then, proceed without me." He slipped out through a narrow passage, deliberately leaving signs of his exit visible enough to be tracked. As he'd hoped, the search team focused on his trail, allowing Sarah and Maya to escape with the documented evidence. Using the jungle skills he'd developed during his isolation, James led his pursuers on a circuitous path away from both the temple and the direction of the larger complex. After several hours of cat and mouse through increasingly dense vegetation, he found what he needed: a tributary river flowing northeast, fashioning a crude raft from fallen logs. James took to the water, using the current to carry him swiftly from his pursuers while conserving his energy. The navigation disk guided him toward the larger facility, its projected path following the river for several miles before veering inland. By nightfall, James had put significant distance between himself and the search team. Making camp on a small island in the river, he consulted the disk again. According to its projections, he was now closer to the main complex than to the original temple. At dawn, he continued northeast, the terrain gradually rising. The vegetation patterns changed subtly. More geometric arrangements of certain species, the same engineered patterns he'd noticed around the first temple. He was getting close. The entrance revealed itself less dramatically than the first, a simple stone doorway set into a hillside, partially obscured by vines but bearing the same mathematical markings. Using techniques he'd learned from the first complex, James activated the opening mechanism. The passage beyond descended steeply, illuminated by the same kinetic energy lamps that activated at his presence. Unlike the original temple's pristine condition, this facility showed signs of deliberate decommissioning, certain equipment removed, sections sealed off, information storage systems emptied. They evacuated, James realized, examining the evidence of organized withdrawal. This wasn't abandonment, it was a planned departure. Moving deeper, he encountered a vast chamber, unlike anything in the first temple. Circular platforms lined the walls, each surrounded by equipment reminiscent of modern medical technology, but far more sophisticated. Central to each platform was a transparent pod, large enough to hold a human-sized subject. Examining the nearest pod, James found controls similar to those in the temple's interface panels. When activated, the pod illuminated from within, and holographic projections appeared above it, DNA sequences, cellular structures, and developmental progressions that shifted in response to parameter adjustments on the control panel. Genetic engineering technology, James whispered, the implications staggering. They were modifying organisms. Further examination revealed more specific evidence. One station displayed comparative anatomical projections of early hominid species alongside the temple builders themselves. Sequential models showed progressive modifications. Subtle changes to cranial capacity, vocal apparatus, neural organization, and metabolic efficiency. Most disturbing were the timestamps accompanying these sequences. According to the facility's records, these modifications had been implemented over a span of thousands of years, coinciding precisely with key evolutionary leaps in human development. They weren't just observers, James realized, cold understanding washing over him. They were directing human evolution. In a recessed section of the chamber, James discovered a final, devastating piece of evidence, a detailed record of the temple builders' intervention program. Their own civilization, facing extinction from a combination of environmental catastrophe and internal conflict, had implemented a long-term project to guide another species, early humans, toward intelligence and technological capability. The record documented periodic adjustments, setbacks, accelerations in the program, a multi-millennia project to essentially create a successor species that might eventually rediscover and carry forward their knowledge. Humanity itself appeared to be the temple builders' final and greatest creation, an inheritance project spanning thousands of generations. James sank to his knees before the display, the philosophical and existential implications overwhelming. Every human achievement, every civilizational milestone, all potentially influenced by this deliberate intervention in our species' development. The truth was simultaneously magnificent and devastating. If humanity learned its origins had been engineered, how would it respond to such knowledge? What would it mean for our understanding of ourselves, our history, our religions, our very identity as a species? No wonder powerful interests wanted this knowledge suppressed. It wasn't just the technologies that threatened existing power structures. It was the very story of human origins itself. James worked feverishly to document the evolutionary chamber, knowing his time was limited. The search teams would eventually track him here, and the evidence had to survive regardless of his fate. Using equipment from his pack, he photographed, recorded, and sampled everything possible, focusing on the clearest evidence of deliberate intervention in human development. As he worked, a pattern in the chamber's layout became apparent. The stations were arranged to direct attention toward a central platform he had initially overlooked. Unlike the modification pods, this circular dais contained a simple pedestal bearing a crystal sphere roughly the size of a human head. The sphere appeared utterly transparent when viewed from certain angles, yet revealed complex internal structures from others, like a higher dimensional object partially intersecting our reality. Surrounding the pedestal were warning symbols James had seen in the workshop of the first temple. Approaching cautiously, he noticed activation panels, similar to those controlling the holographic archives. The interface responded to his touch, displaying a message that Sarah's algorithm could partially translate. Final repository, authorized integration only. Further prompts revealed more information. This sphere contained the accumulated knowledge, consciousness, and wisdom of the temple builders, a distillation of their civilization's essence, preserved not merely as information, but as transferable experiential knowledge. Most remarkable was its purpose. It was designed to integrate with human consciousness once humanity reached sufficient technological and ethical development to handle such knowledge responsibly. The temple builders had created it as their final legacy, a means to guide their successor species when the time was right. James stared at the integration crystal, understanding its profound significance. This wasn't just an artifact. It was potentially the greatest gift one species had ever prepared for another, waiting millennia for humans to mature enough to receive it. A distant explosion shattered his contemplation. The search team had found the facility. James had minutes at most. Hastily gathering his documentation equipment, he faced an impossible decision: attempt to take the integration crystal or leave it behind. The crystal's purpose gave him pause. It had waited thousands of years for the right moment. Was humanity ready? Would exposing its existence now, in a world dominated by power politics and tribal thinking, fulfill or betray the temple builder's intentions? Before he could decide, the facility's ancient security protocols activated. Barricades slid into place, sealing chambers and preserving sensitive areas from intrusion. James found himself trapped in the central section with the integration crystal. Separated from both his pursuers and potential escape routes, through sealed doorways, he heard the search team breaching outer chambers. Their voices carried clearly, military personnel under government authority, discussing asset retrieval and site containment. Among them, he recognized Professor Whitmore's academic tones, directing them toward the primary technological objectives. James turned back to the crystal, understanding he had one option remaining. Interfacing with the control panel again, he requested information about the integration process itself. The response was both fascinating and alarming. The crystal could transfer its contents to a compatible human mind, but the process was designed for humans with specific genetic markers. Markers the temple builders had engineered into certain human lineages. A scan option on the panel offered to check compatibility. James hesitated, then placed his hand on the designated area. The results appeared immediately. Partial compatibility detected, limited integration possible. The facility shook with another explosion, closer this time. The security barricades wouldn't hold much longer. James faced the ultimate decision of his career, perhaps of his life. Attempting integration might destroy his mind if he wasn't sufficiently compatible. Yet leaving the crystal meant surrendering humanity's inheritance to those who would likely suppress or weaponize it. "What makes knowledge dangerous is how we use it," he whispered, recalling words from his first archaeology professor. "Information itself is neutral. Our choices give it meaning." The control panel offered a final option: initiate limited integration. James took a deep breath and pressed yes. The crystal illuminated from within, pulsing with energy patterns that matched human neural firing sequences. As the search team breached the final barrier, James placed his hands on the sphere as indicated by the interface diagrams. Contact was immediate and overwhelming, not information transmitted to his mind, but something far more profound. Perspectives, experiences, and understanding from non-human consciousness flowed into him. Thousands of years of observation, analysis, and wisdom collapsed into moments of pure experiential knowledge. The temple builder's final message became clear through direct understanding rather than language. They had not merely engineered humanity, but had seen in early humans the potential for something they themselves had lost: a balance between technological capacity and emotional wisdom. Their intervention wasn't domination, but nurturing, preparing Earth's native intelligence to avoid their own civilization's mistakes. As military personnel flooded the chamber, James stood transformed. His eyes reflected an inner light that made the hardened soldiers hesitate. Professor Whitmore pushed forward, triumph and avarice battling on his face. "The crystal," Whitmore demanded. "Step away from it, Harrington." James smiled with the serenity of someone who now understood a much larger picture. "You're too late," he said quietly. "Knowledge, once received, cannot be untaken. Secure him," Whitmore ordered. But James raised a hand, and somehow, through mechanisms he now partially understood, the facility responded to his gesture. The remaining security protocols activated, creating a barrier between him and his pursuers. "This knowledge wasn't meant for governments or military applications," James said. "It was meant for humanity, all of humanity when ready." the integration crystal, having completed its primary function, began to deteriorate, its physical form becoming unnecessary once its contents were transferred. James used the momentary confusion to access an evacuation route the temple builders had designed, now visible to his enhanced perception. What followed would become the subject of contentious debate, classified reports and whispered legends in academic circles for years to come. Some claimed James Harrington died in the facility. Others insisted he had escaped with revolutionary knowledge. Still others maintained he had somehow transcended normal human limitations through interaction with the temple technology. The truth lay somewhere beyond all these theories, in the dissemination of certain key discoveries through anonymous academic channels, in the mysterious appearance of transformative technologies in developing regions, and in the gradual, subtle shifting of human understanding toward a more integrated relationship with the knowledge left by our predecessors. The temple builders had planned for millennia. Their patience was finally bearing fruit.